Okay, guys. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. So some of you guys are on the field trip today. Some of you will be watching this on the Tuesday, Wednesday, whatever. Regardless, you all are gonna have the same exact material. So even if I am sitting in the back of the room right now, just know that I'm making you watch this video so that everybody gets the same exact lesson. I'm gonna do my best to get through this as quick as possible. This kind of concludes our lectures on World War One. We're still going to reference World War One, but today we're going to go ahead and we're going to wrap up the entire conflict, and we're going to wrap it up with something called the Treaty of Versailles. So super duper important. And with that, we begin. Okay. So, like I said, today's lesson is the aftermath of World War One, and might not seem that interesting, but you know what? You can't really understand anything else that happens in the remainder of period four without understanding the absolute fiasco that is the Treaty of Versailles. So think back to last week, guys. We concluded World War One. We watched the oversimplified videos. You all sat there and learned about colonial soldiers. Now the war is over. So at 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918, the shooting ends. Okay. Why does it end? Because Germany signed something called an armistice. And I told you all last week to put some stars by that word in your notes for a very, very good reason. And the reason was armistice is not the same as a surrender. So now we got to figure out what armistice means and why some people are going to interpret it differently than others. All right. So World War One becomes known as the war to end all wars. All right. So people immediately start thinking to themselves, you know what? World War One was so bad. We fought for 4 long years. It was atrocious. Millions and millions of people lay dead. We can't have another war like this. Okay. So World War One becomes known as the war to end all wars. And yet, in the aftermath of all of this, the peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, or sometimes called the Paris Peace Conference, becomes the peace to end all peace. Why? Because the Treaty of Versailles was an absolute freaking disaster. And we're going to see that in today's lesson. But first, you guys actually know where this is. This is in Versailles because, of course, this is in the infamous Hall of Mirrors. So what happened in the Hall of Mirrors? Otto von Bismarck declared Germany to be an empire in 1871. In 1783, the Hall of Mirrors, the United States negotiated a treaty with Great Britain and ended the American Revolution. So this is a really, really important place. That's why all those treaties are like the Treaty of Versailles. All right. So let's talk about the armistice. All right. So an armistice is not a surrender. And I don't know how many times I can tell you guys that. An armistice is an agreement made by opposing sides. So Germany is on one side, where the Central Powers are on one side. The Triple Entente is on the other side. They come together. They agree to an armistice. It is essentially a truce. Okay. Now, when they all lay down their guns and they decide to go home, they say, look, in November 1918, we're going to go home. We're going to let the winter pass. And then we're going to come together in Paris in 1919. We'll meet at Versailles. And we're going to figure out what peace looks like who's going to get what in the aftermath of this war, who's going to pay some reparations, all that kind of stuff. So they put down their guns. The Germans walk home. The French walk home. The Americans get on ships and go home. And that's going to be kind of how 1918 ends, with the promise that, again, all of this is going to be sorted out in Paris the following spring. Fun fact, this is actually the armistice right here. And you've got some Germans, some French, some Brits, and some Americans kind of on this exact train signing this peace agreement. And I find this really interesting. And, you don't have to write this down, but this is how petty sometimes the Germans are. So in World War One, the Germans signed the armistice, which effectively ended World War One. They signed it on this train cart. Well, flash forward about 20 years. France later surrenders to the Germans in World War II. And our good friend Adolf Hitler decides to be mad girl petty and pulls out that exact same train cart in which the Germans armistice in World War One and makes the French actually surrender in that same train cart. So if you think you've got some friends that are petty, men in history are just as petty. All right. So let's talk about the unresolved tensions after World War One. So like I said, November 11th, 1918, the armistice is signed. Everybody puts their guns down or they go home, right? They all agree that they're going to get back together in the spring of 1919 to negotiate what this whole peace thing is going to look like. And the actual conference that they're going to get together in is called the Paris Peace Conference. At the Paris Peace Conference is where they eventually signed the Treaty of Versailles. Now, let's talk about who attends the conference. And it's really important to note. Obviously, you have your big three victors, your winners, your triple entente, the United States, Great Britain, and France. Okay, they're the winners, right? So they're going to be the ones that ultimately decide what is going to be in the Treaty of Versailles. They're going to be the ones that ultimately decide who's going to pay what amount of money, who's going to get this land, who's going to get this blame, yada, yada, yada. All right. So ultimately, the Triple Entente, and this is who you see in this picture right here. So this is Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States. This is the French president and the British president. Okay, this guy right here is actually a German negotiator, but don't worry about that. Now, the result of the Triple Entente getting together in Paris is the Treaty of Versailles. All right, so if you haven't, put some stars by that in your notes, because this is what this whole lesson is going to be on. And of course, they signed the treaty in the Hall of Mirrors, which is the picture that you guys just saw. So let's talk about who wins World War I based on the Treaty of Versailles. Actually, let's talk about who loses World War I. So first off, Russia. Why does Russia lose World War I? Well, Russia doesn't even exist at the end of World War I. Remember, they collapsed in 1917 and they became the Soviet Union. Germany. We're going to get to all the ways that Germany gets screwed over by World War I, but just know that they are a loser. The Ottomans, another country that does not exist at the end of World War I, and we'll explain that later at another time. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, guys. Another empire that doesn't exist at the end of World War I, so goodbye. Who else loses World War I? Great Britain. Wait a second, I thought they were on the Triple Entente. They lose because of the Treaty of Versailles. Just wait if you don't believe me. France also loses because of the Treaty of Versailles. The United States also loses because of the Treaty of Versailles. So if you're keeping track, everybody loses because of the Treaty of Versailles. And let's talk about what that means. Now, the most positive thing that comes out of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles is something called the League of Nations. Okay. Now, if we were in class right now, I would say, have you guys heard about the League of Nations? And most of you would say no. Because even though the Treaty of Versailles creates the League of Nations, and yay, that's a good thing at first, turns out the League of Nations is going to be a fiasco and a failure and doesn't actually prevent World War II. So it's a really good idea at the time, but doesn't ultimately succeed at its ultimate goal. But what we can say about the League of Nations is it's kind of like the early version of the UN. So the United Nations, something that still exists today. So essentially what the League of Nations is the American president Woodrow Wilson wanted this created. He wanted this in the Treaty of Versailles. And he wanted essentially a place where there was a big long table where every country in the world could get together and sit at that table and ultimately talk through their issues with each other. So he basically wanted a place where everybody could hold hands, sing Kumbaya, and maybe prevent a whole other world war, because that could be a bad thing if we had a second one, which, spoiler alert, we do. But the League of Nations was a great idea, and I don't think any of you would argue that having a place where people could discuss their issues is a bad thing. But obviously, it doesn't succeed at doing what it's initially supposed to do. Now, let's talk about the biggest problems with the Treaty of Versailles. And before we go country by country and I discuss with you each problem, I want to make sure you all have this definition down. Some of you have heard the word reparations before. Let me explain that how reparations applies to World War I. So first off, reparations, by definition, are compensation given for an abuse or injury. So if you've done something hurtful to somebody, a reparation would be, and maybe you give them some money because you've damaged them in some way. So how does this apply to World War I? So in the aftermath, in the creation of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was made to pay reparations to the Triple Entente. And they weren't just any reparations. Okay, they weren't reparations that were fair in the slightest. They were incredibly unfair, crippling, destructive to the German economy. Okay, the reparations were incredibly, incredibly harsh, and they were meant to be harsh because France wanted Germany to be punished. Remember, France lost a lot of people, and they wanted to make Germany pay. So at the time, they were going to force Germany to pay about $55 billion. And that doesn't seem like, I mean, it does seem like a lot in today's, but imagine that adjusted for inflation. All right, it's going to be an incredible amount of money that Germany is going to be forced to pay. Furthermore, France wants Germany to accept all the blame for the war. Not the Black Hand, not Serbia, not Franz Ferdinand's death. France puts into the Treaty of Versailles that Germany will be forced to accept every amount of blame for this war, which, as you can imagine, really is not fair to Germany. Remember, Germany did not sign a surrender. So how can you force them to accept all the war blame? Furthermore, and this is where things get really crazy, Germany is forced to cede a third of its territory. So I've shown you guys maps of Germany at the start of World War I, and Germany looks like this right here, this big country. So in the aftermath of the war, Germany is forced to give all of this up, as well as some area in the north and some area in the south. Now, you guys might remember this area down here in the south actually belonged to France before 1871. So France wanted that land back anyway. But if you're Germany and you have just signed an armistice and you're being punished for basically signing a surrender, you're going to be real butthurt. And the everyday average German people were incredibly bitter about the Treaty of Versailles and how it treated Germans. And one of the reasons that you even see that bitterness kind of blows up into the fact that people are so upset, they're so angry, they're ready to point fingers and blame anybody. And that kind of allows for a young, charismatic man, a man named Adolf Hitler, who you actually see in this picture right up here. He's this guy right here, who's going to come to power because he's going to say, the Treaty of Reparations has destroyed Germany. If you put me into power, I'm going to fix it. Okay? So I want you to be thinking about that for next week's lesson when we talk about the rise of fascism. Fun fact, Germany is, I think, the 6th most powerful economy in the world today. And it took them all the way until 2010 to finish paying off reparations. That is how serious reparations were. $55 billion with interest, and Germany paid it back, which is super impressive. And like, it's one of those things where it's like, you have to sit back and be like, go Germany. Okay, so let's move on to how the Treaty of Versailles screwed other countries. Russia. Now, you guys might remember that Russia dropped out of the war in 1917. Why? Because of a successful communist revolt. And we're going to talk about that revolt on Thursday in this class. All right. So at the end of the conflict, Russia is now a new country. Russia doesn't exist. The Romanovs are dead. Russia is now a country called the USSR, the Soviet Union. And Russia fought for 3 years alongside of Great Britain and France, 3 years. They were part of the Triple Entente. And so when Germany eventually surrendered in 1918, Russia assumed that their former allies would treat Russia fairly, or the Soviet Union fairly. And that's not what happened. Great Britain and France were like, guys, you dropped out of the war, so why should we give you any concessions? The Soviet Union is actually going to feel betrayed by its former allies. The Soviet Union expects some of their land to be given back, the land that they surrendered to Germany in 1917, but instead they get nothing. They're not even invited to Paris to partake in the Treaty of Versailles, the peace talks. And so going forward, the Soviet Union is not going to trust Western democracies. They're not going to trust the United States. They're not going to trust Great Britain, France. And so that's going to pave the way for some pretty serious problems later on. So remember that, guys. Japan. So we didn't really talk that much about what Japan did in World War I. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you right now that towards the end of the war, Japan joined the Triple Entente. Why? Because there was a bunch of colonies in the South Pacific that Germany owned. And Japan felt like, hey, if we at least show some support to Great Britain and France and the United States, maybe they'll take Germany's colonies and give them to us. So Japan also kind of felt like because they fought with the Triple Entente, they would be treated equally. So when the Paris Peace Conference was going on in 1919, the Japanese are going to send some ambassadors and some representatives to Paris, thinking that, hey, we fought alongside the Brits, the French, and the Americans. We probably need to be treated equally. But as soon as these Japanese ambassadors got to Paris, they weren't even allowed to sit in the same room as the white people. Okay. Great Britain, France, and the United States refused to even give them a seat at the table. And I won't pretend that there's some sort of reason other than just pure racism. Okay. The Japanese leave Paris believing that no matter what they do, they can industrialize, they can beat Russia, they can, join the Triple Entente, but they're never going to be treated as equals. And so Japan is going to leave Paris and they're going to be disgusted and horrified by Western democracy, specifically the United States, specifically Great Britain and France. They're also going to have problems with these Christian democracies. All right. So remember, Japan has never been very, very fond of Christianity. And so the Japanese are going to lump Christianity and democracy together. So what is Japan going to do? Well, the Japanese were going to return back to Japan, thinking that they're going to get all these extra colonies and not get extra colonies. And instead, they're going to take that money, which they would have used, and they're going to start putting more into their military because they don't trust democracy. So they're going to build up their military and they're going to start expanding their empire to protect themselves because, again, they do not trust Western democracies. I feel like that's leading us to something if you know your history. Italy. Now, you guys might remember that Italy started with the Central Powers. They were in an alliance with Germany, right? And then after about 5 minutes of World War I, they decided, we're going to sit this one out, guys. We're not going to go to war over Franz Ferdinand. So about halfway through the war, some British ambassadors went to Italy, and they essentially promised Italy, like, if you fight for the Triple Entente, we're going to give you all this land in Europe. We're going to give you this land in northern what is now northern Italy, and we're going to give you all of this land on the other side. So what is like now modern day Croatia. So Italy eventually joins the war. They fight on the side of the Triple Entente. And then after the war, they expect to get the land they were promised by the British. Turns out they get way less than they were promised. They were only given this land out of Germany, not any of this land. And so the Italians are furious. They were promised a bunch of land and then they never received that land. And so everyday Italians start to think like, this is ridiculous. Like this democracy promised us land and we were not given this land. So this is ridiculous. And what ends up starting to happen is you start to see the radicalization of Italy. People start getting very, very upset. They get very distrustful of democracy. And eventually it makes way for the emergence of a leader, a man named Benito Mussolini. Benito Mussolini is also the founder and creator of a new political style called fascism. It's not Hitler, but it is Mussolini. Mussolini will eventually, in a free and fair election, become the leader of Italy, and he will also be the first fascist dictator. So Italy is going to be the first one to go in the bad direction for World War II. All right. Next, the United States. All right. The United States, back-to-back World War champs. Am I right? We show up in late 1917. We fight for a couple months and we beat the Germans. Yay for us. All right. We bring hope to the French and the British. We like completely changed the game. American soldiers died to win this war. And so America wins for the Triple Entente. There's just no arguing about it. Well, turns out after World War I, when we go back to America, our government, and guys, I know this is crazy, but our government, the Republicans and the Democrats don't get along. Like, I know, mind blowing. It's like, that's never happened before, right? Just kidding. And so the leaders in the United States, specifically the Republicans, they do not want another world war. And so when Woodrow Wilson comes back after the Paris Peace Conference and he presents the Treaty of Versailles to Congress, Congress actually refuses to sign the treaty and they refuse to join the League of Nations. So remember, in the United States, you need Congress to do anything. And so when they refuse to join the League of Nations and to sign the Paris Peace Conference, to sign the Treaty of Versailles, the United States essentially becomes an isolationist country. So in 1919, the United States says, look, we don't need anything from anybody. We are the greatest country on earth. We're going to go back to being the greatest country on earth, but we're going to basically rebuild our own walls. So the United States goes back to being politically isolationist. It doesn't participate in the League of Nations, and they pretty much don't participate in any affairs until World War II. More problems with the treaty. Guys, I've talked a lot about colonists, or I've talked a lot about colonial soldiers. We mentioned how unfairly they were treated, and I don't think any of you could really argue about how these men fought and died alongside their compatriots, the British, the French, the Germans, and yet they were never given that front trench opportunity to really be heroic. But these colonists had believed that because they fought in this war, that they had proven their citizenship. They believed that because they had shown their colonial overlords that they deserved to be free. And so non-white colonists are going to promote nationalism, and they're going to say to themselves, we fought, we died for you. Now it's time for you to give us independence. These colonists believed that they had earned a nation state. And you see Indian soldiers returning to India saying, we deserve to be free. You see West African soldiers returning to West Africa saying, we deserve to be free. And naturally, of course, they are not given that freedom. Okay. They're not going to be given that freedom until World War II, but they feel like they have earned it. So you're going to start seeing some animosity growing towards the empires. All right. Now, guys, I would love for y'all to take a very, very, very good look at these two maps. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. SAQ Friday. What did I just, So what you're seeing in this map could very well be a good SAQ question. Identify one country that emerged in the aftermath of World War I. So you look at Europe pre-World War I, and you see the big empires, Portugal, Spain, France, Germany, Italy, Austro-Hungarian Empire, yada, yada. After World War I, look at all the different countries that emerge, okay? You see Germany being split up into things like Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. All right, you see countries like the Austro-Hungarian Empire becomes Hungary, Austria, Czechoslovakia. Romania gets bigger. Yugoslavia becomes a thing. All right. Also, another big one, guys, Russia, by the end of World War I, completely collapses and becomes the Soviet Union. So these are some really, really important things to make sure you understand that World War I is totally going to change the map, specifically in Europe. And if you think that's bad, wait until after World War II. But that's not all, guys. And again, I don't know about you, but this really sounds like some good SAQ. And think about how the map changes in the aftermath of World War I. So this map we've got in front of us is map of the world circa, let's say, 1914. Okay, you've got the Russian Empire, you've got France, you've got Germany, all right, you've got Spain, you've got Great Britain, United States, Canada, all these things. So take this, 4 years of bloody fighting in the dirt, in the mud, in the trenches, and let's see how the map changes. Yeah, it changes. I would say it changes, and it changes in ways that you might not imagine. So back to 1914, let's look at 1919. Back to 1914, 1919. All right, Russia has become the Soviet Union. Look at all these countries, how they've broken down. You see all the emergence of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. All right. You also see Japan start to come into East Asia. That's going to really kind of foreshadow us for World War I. All of the former German colonies in Africa suddenly become British colonies. Look at that. And with that, let's talk about something called mandates. Mandates are really, really important. Every year that I teach this class, I always try to make sure my students understand mandates, because mandates are going to explain to you exactly what's going on in the Middle East right now. So when World War I is finished, Germany loses and all of its alliance loses. The Austro-Hungarian Empire ceases to exist. The Ottoman Empire ceases to exist. So what are you going to do with all that land that used to be these giant empires? And when Germany is no longer allowed to have its colonies overseas as part of the Treaty of Versailles, what you going to do with all those colonies? So all of the former colonies of Germany and the Ottoman Empire are going to be gifted to the French and the British. And we're going to call these new colonies mandates. All right. Now, probably, in my opinion, the most important of these mandates, sure, these little colonies in Africa are important, but the most important to understand 2025 is the mandate of the Middle East. Okay. So the Middle East right here, you've got Syria, you've got modern day, what we now know as Israel, Palestine. All right. What we now know as Iraq. These are all former land, some colonies of the Ottoman Empire, and they are just handed to the British and the French. Now, these people in the Middle East, they fought for the Triple Entente. All right. We had lots of soldiers of Arab heritage fighting alongside the British, fighting alongside the French. And they believed that once they were going to be free, that the British and the French were going to free them. LOL, nope. And instead, the British and the French hold on to these new colonies and essentially refuse to let them go. So these people, specifically in a place called Palestine, feel incredibly betrayed. They thought that fighting with the British meant they were going to be independent and they were going to have their own country, the country of Palestine. And instead, Great Britain said, LOL, nope, you are now part of the mighty British Empire. Yay, congrats. Pay some taxes. So understand that this is going to be a big deal. Why is this going to be a big deal? Well, this land right here, after World War II, the British are going to feel really bad for a group of people that were persecuted by the Nazis. And they are going to give this land to the Jewish people, even though that land never really belonged to them. Okay, it was part of Palestine. It was owned by the Palestinian people. And so the British are eventually going to give that land away when it never really was theirs to start with. So keep that in mind when you hear things going on in the news. Guys, the last thing I need to tell you about today is another colonial power and how the Treaty of Versailles kind of sets the stage for their kind of like big moment. So in your notes, when you write down the Indian National Congress, you go ahead and you put some nice big old stars by this. All right. The Indian National Congress is going to be an anti-imperial nationalist group. And this group was founded by our good friend Mahatma Gandhi. I'm sure you guys have heard of Gandhi. All right. He's the leader of the nonviolent, he's the one that inspired Martin Luther King Jr. Well, what you probably didn't know about Gandhi was that he actually fought in World War I. But because he was a colonist, he didn't fight in the trenches. He was actually an ambulance driver. And so he picked soldiers up from the front, he brought them and he treated them medically. And while Gandhi was serving in World War I, he started to get the idea that, look, I have fought for the British. My men have died for the British. It's time for us to have our own country. We have proven ourselves. We have proven our citizenships. And so he started to think to himself that maybe if he fought hard and all these other Indian soldiers fought really hard, then maybe Great Britain would grant them the nation state of India in the aftermath of World War I. And so after World War I is over, Gandhi and many, many, many colonial soldiers from India said to Great Britain, hey, are you gonna let us go? We did our part, come on. And instead, because Great Britain is in dire straits in terms of money, Great Britain actually tightens their hold on India. They continue extracting even more resources from India, refusing to allow India independence. And what that leads to is an increasing tension between Great Britain and India. All right. And Gandhi is going to create the Indian National Congress as a way to start pushing against the British. Like, hey, you got to give us independence. You got to give us independence, even though the British want no part of it. All right. So guys, good job. Keep this in mind. This stuff is fair game for the SAQ that you're going to have on Friday. Let me know if you have questions. I will see you guys tomorrow. Have a good day.